Okay, so we're going to begin reading Cake, a chapter from Tentacles by Roland Smith. The kitchen, or galley, was next to a large communal mess hall. There was a lot of people sitting at tables, drinking coffee and eating. Marty didn't recognize any of them. The mess was set up buffet style. Men and women in white uniforms scurried back and forth from the galley to the buffet corner, replenishing trays and pans of food. Marty walked through the swinging doors into the galley, expecting to see Bertha Bishop, directing the cooks and servers. Instead, he found a little man standing on a small stool, shouting orders at the frenzied staff. He was pudgy, with long, greasy black hair, a scraggly beard, crooked yellow teeth, and beady brown eyes. He glared at Marty and shouted, "What are you doing in here? Serving staff and cooks only." He pointed an index finger at the doors. "Get out. Where's Bertha?" Marty tried to Lutherize him with a goofy grin. It didn't work on this guy. The man scowled, hopped off his perch, and strode over to Marty like he was going to hit him, but Marty held his ground. He had to bake a cake for Grace, and he wasn't about to get booted out. "I'm in charge here," the man said. "Bertha's back on Kryptos with Phil." This was news to Marty. He had just talked to Bertha the day before. She was worried about how she was going to cook for a crew of 50. Marty had offered to give her a hand whenever he could. The man swept his hand around the galley. "I don't think she could handle this," he said. Marty laughed. There wasn't anything Bertha couldn't do, including kill the little man standing in front of him with nothing more than her index finger. The noisy galley had gone completely silent. Not a pot or pan cluttered as the workers stared at the confrontation. "I have to make a birthday cake for Grace. I'm Marty O'Hara, and Travis Wolfe is Marty said. Yeah, we know," the man interrupted. "He's your uncle. Big deal. We've heard a lot about you and your snotty cousin." It took a lot to make Marty mad, but the man had crossed the line. Marty's fist clenched and his face flushed. Grace was a little snotty at times, but with good reason. She was smarter than anyone he knew, and no one was allowed to call her snotty except Marty, and maybe Luther. Marty had defended Grace when he thought she was his twin sister, and that wasn't going to stop him now that they were only cousins. He glanced at the man's hands to make sure he wasn't holding a butcher's knife or a meat cleaver, and took a step forward. "What's going on here?" Alex shouted as he barged through the swinging doors. Marty and the man nearly jumped out of their shoes. Miniature cameras, Marty thought, glancing up at the ceiling, just like the ones on the Dragon Spy. They'd be invisible unless you knew where to look. Joe, or Roy, must have called Al and told him there was trouble in the galley. "Nuttin', Mr. Ikes," the chef said. "I was just telling the kid that he can't come waltzing in here and push us around just because he's Dr. Wolfe's nephew. We're a little busy making sure the crew gets their grub." He didn't like it and started mouthing off. That was a blatant lie, of course, but Marty didn't contradict the man. He was curious about the extent of Al Ike's surveillance capabilities, and this might be a good way to find out. Al stared at the chef. "You and I." "No, that's not what happened, Theo," he said. So the chef's name is Theo, Marty thought. "And Al can see as well as hear everything we're doing aboard ship." "It's exactly what happened," Theo said. "That kid thinks he owns the ship. Wants to bake a cake for crying out loud." He scowled at Marty. "Like he could bake a cake. We don't have any cake mix. We set sail before all our supplies got here. We'll be lucky if we don't starve to death before we get to New Zealand." "I've never used cake mix," Marty said. "I make my cakes from scratch." "Yeah, right," Theo said. Marty ignored him and turned to Al. "I thought Bertha was going to handle the cooking on board." "Change of plans," Al said. "She and Phil will be joining us later. They stayed on the island to tie up some loose ends. We have some new caretakers arriving on Kryptos in a couple of days. a Mr. and Mrs. Hickok and their son, Dylan. Phil and Bertha need to brief them before they turn the island over. Marty looked at Theo. So you're just the temporary chef until Bertha joins us. So what, Theo said. Until she gets here, I'm still in charge. And I still need to make a cake for Grace's birthday, Marty said. And I've never used a cake mix. I assure you. I assume you have flour, milk, sugar, eggs, butter. Well, what do you think? Theo said belligerently. Enough, Al shouted. Anytime Marty comes in here, I want your full cooperation. He paused and looked at everyone in the galley. That applies to all of you, and it's not because he's Travis Wolf's nephew. It's because I told you to cooperate. He looked back at Theo and lowered his voice. And if you lie to me again, Theo, I will personally throw you overboard. The last person on earth Marty thought would come to his defense was Al Ikes. I'm watching you, Theo, Al continued under his breath. Marty was not rude when he came in, and Grace is not snotty. Grace actually liked Al Ikes and got along with him, something Marty did not understand until that moment. Theo looked confused. He obviously didn't know a thing about the surveillance cameras peppered around the ship, and Marty wasn't about to tell him. Go bake your cake, Al said, and left the galley. Theo got back on his stool a little shakily and told everyone to get back to work, but not nearly as loudly or harshly as he had spoken to them before. And Marty baked a birthday cake from scratch.